Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste.
Happy to be with all of you and welcome to everyone.
Today we are happy to continue the 10th installment of our special theme, How We Can Carry the Growth of Consciousness Deliberately into Our Next Life. And we start with the first question or a comment that we received from Maya. Thank you for such a thorough explanation, and the last part was especially beautiful. I never fully understood the value of practices like writing lines from Savitri every day, but after you read from the chapter of the world soul and we felt the lift in our aspiration, I felt for the first time how it could be a very valuable form of psychic development if done in the right way. It was only a few lines, but it was as if suddenly woke us up to a deeper light and beauty and the yearning to live in that all the time. For the first time, I realized the importance of Savitri. Thank you very much.
Yes, it's more of a comment, but I thought it worth sharing because many would have felt something similar, and it helps to articulate and to recognize more formally the value of what was felt or experienced. In particular, I want to highlight two elements. First, that as we were reading from that passage of the world soul, there was a dwelling on the lines. And the dwelling allowed us to enter more deeply into the nature of the experience itself. If, as many do, they read lines either mechanically or with the idea that there will be a mantric vibration which will anyway take care of itself, which is of course legitimate, it will have a certain limited effect. But if you pause, if you dwell, if you savor and enter into, especially if there's a slight intuitive opening, you enter into what is being described and touch the vibration of the experience behind those lines, then each line as if deepens, widens, and adds depth and richness, taking you into the fullness of the experience more and more. The first time that you read that text, you would have a certain experience. You would say, wow, this is so wonderful. But the second time when you have the same text and with the same effort, because of the prior base of experience that was already prepared, this time you're able to go much more deeply with exactly the same lines, with exactly the same content in the sense transmitted by Sri Aurobindo. That content was so deep, so full, you only touched the first layer because it was your first exposure. The second time, because that first exposure has been reasonably, perhaps has become familiar, you're able to go much deeper. And the third time, much more and more and more. And it is in this way that we have to understand the power of a mantric text such as Savitri. What it contains is the power to take you into the fullness of the experience, but your ability to receive or enter or record or open to that experience is limited. At first, it's even perhaps fully closed. And so successively, layer by layer, you as if enter deeper into the experience. The tendency, though, in us will be to try to replicate the first experience. Oh, last time I felt this, I must get back to that. No, allow each reading to take you in its own way. And there you will notice that what in the first experience was perhaps full of one aspect and another aspect was largely ignored. This time in the second reading, the second aspect is stronger and the first aspect may be almost dim. Because according to your readiness and the need of your inner being, the thing most needed or the most accessible at that moment is deeply felt. And so various aspects appear. And then you say, well, each time it's been different. What about that? I want all these completely together. And there is an experience then of something which integrates these different facets. And so when done in this way, and Maya has rightly used this term, very valuable form of psychic development if done in the right way. When done in this way, you can see the tremendous utility and power that Sri Aurobindo has given to us in this poem of Savitri. Across the various passages of Savitri, everything is covered. Everything in the universe has been touched, because literally the nature of the journey and narration covers everything. And although you have a limited finite number of lines, as we saw last time in the passage which relates to the psychic worlds, with those finite number of lines, the entry into the experience can open to its infinity. Equally, for the purpose of understanding, for dwelling in the mind, it was useful to have already read the passage which we are reading from the Life Divine. So it's not enough that somebody says, I will just read Savitri and let it happen. Yes, it will be useful, but there will be parts where your capacity to understand the participation of your intelligence and the knowledge aspect, and which are necessary to the fullness of the experience, would be limited, would be constrained, because the preconceptions and even wrong understandings are too deeply rooted. So even as an experience opens, your preconceptions would limit, your wrong understanding would distort, and you would always be stuck with a partial capacity to perceive or experience, even though he has behind it the full power. Of course, if you were to open fully, which most of us would find very hard to do in the beginning, one might still get into the experience and then experience a conflict between what I thought it was supposed to be and what I got. And that itself would be a disturbance to the experience. So it helps enormously to have studied the Life Divine and the descriptions there and the broad framework of that structure. And then when you reread now and allow the experience of what is already known and what is being revealed now to soak in, the impact is so much greater. Most importantly, because this had to do with the nature of the psychic world, we felt tremendous immersion in the psychic presence, and its transforming imprint in us is so powerful. And so it is worth repeating, rereading, dwelling. And then after a while, after a point, you'll find, okay, now I'm not getting any more further results. You need to move on to something else. And then later come back to this when there has been a deeper assimilation. And so when you treat it in this way, that Savitri can be used as a vehicle, a staircase, a ladder for the ascension of consciousness in the sadhana itself. And still, I will say, and I will insist perhaps, combine it with the larger reading of Sri Aurobindo's works, which will complement and assist this. And that will give the most fullness, the greatest fullness to the experience. So, and then when you write, if you write, my teacher MP Pandit recommended this as a practice for many people, every day to write one page from Savitri. You copy it out. You can dwell in it as you write, or simply focus on the general sense of the presence or the communion. But if done in this way, with the fullness of it, the act of writing makes it as if your expression, and at the same time fixes into the physical consciousness in the act of writing, particularly the part of the mind that embeds into the physical body, fixes into it the experience you're having at that moment. And this is the layer often which Sri Aurobindo refers to as the physical mind, which is often the most skeptical, the most resistant, the most opposing even in some people to the deeper unfolding of experiences. So if when infused in this, and this part layer begins to touch the experience, the key points of resistance are easily overcome, rapidly overcome, making everything else useful. So I'm using Maya's comment as a starting point to give you a broader picture of how this can be done. And I would highly recommend for those of you who feel so drawn to experiment with this, explore how it works for you, try out variations, and always it will be the value of the experience you have, which will be a reference for how useful that kind of practice can be. Don't do it merely as a mechanical practice. We can go to the next.
From Anupam, how to persuade the vital to participate in Divine's work, because it is the only thing which is always playing with the mind and makes it restless or agitated. Please help. And from Maya, at the end of the talk, at 2 hours and 8 minutes, you said something very useful, that if we get in the habit of familiarizing ourselves with our deepest center, and touch something of this psychic influence on a daily basis and act from there or bring that influence out, then it naturally touches all the other sheets and helps them to grow, purify, and to align to our central divine purpose. This point is very helpful and practical for many who might focus individually on trouble spots in their nature that pull them out of their central purpose and who try and coax or help these parts the harder way instead of the easier way, inside to out, through the psychic influence. You highlighted a very joyful path to take instead.
So Anupam's question is in some sense answered by Maya's observation. And this was something important that we touched in passing in the discussion last time, that it is a critical element of the integral yoga, which aims at a transformation of nature and a divinization of nature, to familiarize all the parts of our nature with that which represents or which is the closest to you, representing the psychic influence and the spiritual influence, generally the divine, we will say, or the divine mother. Familiarizing that relationship, familiarizing with that vibration, familiarizing with that presence, familiarizing with the experiences and the immersion in the experiences. It's the familiarity which is the key by which you will find yourself easily able to access that, recover that if lost, and most important, infuse in a sustained way that influence in your daily life in those parts. So if the goal is to transform, if the goal is to divinize, this becomes essential. In a more ascetic path, where the goal is to withdraw or simply to get to a higher or inner state, abandoning all else, none of this is important. And so I'm highlighting this because you will not find this as a practice in almost all of the conventionally known traditional paths taught. And most of us are deeply infected with those kinds of teachings and the ascetic principles and the idea of the hard labor and struggle involved there. But when we take this path, where the goal is to this divinize and transform, and we dwell upon this familiarization and the infusion of the influence into these parts, the nature of the sadhana is no more a struggle. It is no more a hard path. It becomes a growth from joy to greater joy. And in the parts, as Anupam raised this question, in the parts where you feel the resistance, it could be in the part of the physical mind that we mentioned earlier, it could be in the part of the vital energies and life force and their drives and passions or desires in whatever form it takes, their agitation and restlessness, as Anupam points out. Whatever the thing will be, these parts, when they meet the presence, immediately recognize and enjoy that influence and begin then gradually through the repeated contact to crave it. And then they feel in themselves what allows me to feel that more easily and stay attuned more easily. And when, for example, in the vital layers, and the restlessness of the vital, let's say, something of that calm and deep joy and peace of the presence is felt, that part of the vital says, oh, I want to live in this all the time. And begins now to align to that influence and open to it more and more. Once the familiarity is built, when the first time it happens, oh, it feels so nice, now it's gone, let's say by tomorrow, after a sleep or after some disturbance, the experience goes away. What is that? I don't even remember. I remember it was nice, but I don't remember what it felt like. That's when the familiarity is lacking. So you'll make a second effort and a third effort. Each time that you have this, you will extend the state of immersion and influence as much as possible into basic activities. That's how you will build familiarity. And when that familiarity has been sufficiently developed, at any point, that restless part of the vital, let's say, will remember, yes, that's what it feels like, because I've had it so many times. The familiarity is there. The memory of the experience is there. And so now, leaning back into the memory of the experience, I can lean back, even recover something of the experience, or at least open myself to that influence and allow a new experience to begin to fill and flow. And so this familiarity is so important. When you work in this way, rather than struggling with parts which are resistant or opposing or simply uninterested in the deeper and higher, rather than struggling with them, this gentle seeping and familiarizing turns them to yearn, to aspire for, even to want sometimes intensely that presence again and again. And what you have struggled with before now becomes a very easy process. So I would recommend for Anupam to dwell upon this part of the discussion from last time as well as now. Practice this. Maybe you listen to that discussion again, for example. Allow yourself to enter that mood, and then let that mood infuse into those very parts where you feel restless. I would suggest, even depending on how harsh the activity might be to disrupt the state, you might even take up an activity where you normally don't feel the presence, but take it up in a slow, gentle way while holding the presence and the state, and infuse it into the activity, into the movement. You see, a critical element which is forgotten, again, because of the quietistic and ascetic practices, in contrast to the more dynamic aspect of the integral yoga, one thing which is forgotten is it's not enough that you infuse while the part is silent. You have to infuse while the part is active. So when your mind is quiet, your emotions are quiet, you feel the presence, it's nice, good. The moment your mind starts thinking, working, and the emotions and life energies are in activity, you lose everything. The idea is now to infuse while in their activity. Of course, you can't pick them in intensity of activity. You pick upon them while they are in a mild movement of activity. And from the stillness where you first stabilize the experience, you gently seep them, extend them into simple, gentle, soft movement activity. Don't go too harsh too quickly, bit by bit. And you will find not at all with difficulty, with quite an ease, you will find in these parts gradually that same experience continues while they are in basic, slow, gentle activity. And from there, you just continue to extend. So in the part where you feel restless, and if there's an activity in which that restlessness is most commonly felt, well, from this state, move into that activity slightly, not too harsh. Habituate yourself to holding this influence, this state, in the active part of your life force, life vital, or your mind or body, whatever the form it may be. And then thus extend. So this would be very helpful as a practice for all. You can go to the next question.
From Hanel. Amazing explanation through this series. I'm trying every night to develop conscious sleep in dreams, just as advised by the mother in her talks about healing and yoga. I'm really trying to stay conscious every day and night to avoid falling into unconscious state. Still, I systematically fall into unconscious dreams, and every night it is some nightmares related to vital worlds. That's why I don't even try to master leaving my body consciously, as I might very likely end up pulled in some lower vital world, unprotected, facing these hostile forces. It is quite a paradox that I can reach so deep experiences in meditation while awake, but still no awareness can follow me into the sleep state. Is developing awareness both while sleeping and awake a necessary skill for conscious reincarnation? Without this, will we lack individualization of the subtle body and the movement we leave the body at the moment when we leave the body?
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting question, and evokes many complex aspects to this experience. But in principle, to the question itself, is it necessary to develop the awareness? Generally, I will say yes. But it need not be the way that you're trying to do. And it can be done perhaps in a more simple way to begin with. And the lack of individualization may not again be based on this grade of awareness, but yes, some kind of awareness will be developed. But already the effort that you're making is helping to form that. And the fact that you persist in this effort daily is extremely important. And it's already made huge changes internally. If you observe within you, you might notice. Since you have set yourself a reference of those nightmares, you're not seeing much change. But if you notice of what's happening in the quality of your individualized awareness, and the fact that there is a center of aspiration within you during most of the day, and something of this state actually extends into the night, it's a huge achievement. You have not described it, but it's obvious from what you're describing that you have got to that point. And so observe those things, value them. You will notice, for example, as you go into sleep with this intention to hold this conscious state day and night, you're going to sleep with that. Perhaps you tend, as you say, to fall into some unconscious dream. But when you wake up, that same intention is present as you wake up. And you only need to refer back to it. Ah, yes, it's still there. And you will feel as if a thread of that continued through the night. Notice this, observe this. What you've already come to is extremely valuable. I've kept the full question in detail because I hope it will inspire others also to take up similar efforts or other variations of what you feel helpful. But you notice this sense of continuity subliminally. A part in you feels as if, ah, yes, this thing was always present, though I do not have conscious recall. The sense of a subliminal continuity is there like a thread. Catch that. It is in that grade that the sense of conscious awareness will remain during the night. So the mistake being made is, or rather the limited result is because the idea of what it means to stay conscious during the night is still somewhat blurred, I will say. And it's normal because we start with what we have. And with the experience, that thing will shift. And in this case, you will catch that thread. Catch that. Notice that there is a continuity. It's not quite the same as the waking state awareness, but it's a different kind of awareness. It still has a quality which might be almost mental. Notice that. But it's a thread which is as if deep within inside, subliminal or behind the veil. And you'll feel what that feels like when you feel this sense of continuity. Once you've got this thread and the sense of what it feels like behind the veil or subliminal, whatever term would be appropriate to the way you feel it. Once you feel this at night, as you're about to drift into sleep, you remember that sense of that thread and that continuity. And as if lean back into this and drift off into sleep. But leaning back into this, it's as if you're amplifying or leaning back. Can you hear me?
Yes, it is fine.
Okay, I'm sorry there was a disruption for some reason.
Yes. I think by mistake someone joined in, okay?
Okay. No, my Zoom just shut suddenly by mistake. Okay, I think we are back on.
Yes.
Okay, I was describing the sense of the underlying continuity. Do you remember, Alina, what was the word where it cut off? At what point?
I don't remember exactly, but
Okay.
you were saying about how to keep the thread, how
So
to
notice
fly
the sense of the thread of awareness. At the point where you wake up, the sense as if something behind the scenes, deep within you, but of a grade which is mental, behind the conscious, let's say, like a curtain, so subliminal. It feels like this, Become familiar with that sense of the thread and the sense of the continuity. Catch that. Next evening, when you go to sleep, remember that sense of the thread. Lean back into it. Lean back into what it feels like. That's a different grade of awareness from your surface waking mind. The surface waking mind will go to sleep. You will have to learn to as if drift towards that thread, towards that quality. So as if you lean back and drift into that, and don't worry if you go to sleep, but hold that intention to maintain this continuity in that thread. And again, when you wake up, you will notice, the sense of the thread is still present, this time more vivid. And over a few nights, you will actually develop, maybe over a few weeks, you will actually develop the sense as if in the thread itself, the consciousness is becoming more awake. Or rather, you are building a continuity from that thread, subliminal continuity, to the surface waking consciousness. That link is being formed. It's very valuable, very precious. Once that is reasonably stable, you will actually have the sense that I'm conscious during the night, even in that particular grade. Okay, so play with this, explore this line of experience, and you'll find a lot of what you're trying to do will become very easy. I still want to point to the problem you're having of falling into some nightmare relating to the vital worlds. Recognize that during the sleep, we are asleep on many levels. On each of these levels, there is a dream. Your current effort is to hold this poise in a grade which is approaching more of the mental grade of consciousness. And that's the link, that's the thread which we have been discussing so far. But in the vital nature, in the vital part, especially where that particular nightmare is happening, this intention or the opening from there to the higher has not yet happened enough. So for this, you would do a different exercise. If you wake up with the memory of the nightmare, try to catch at what grade of consciousness you have experienced the nightmare. And you'll feel it comes at something, maybe there's a physical grade associated with the location, or just the quality is this kind of a coarse, heavy part of the vital. Very likely it's something approaching the vital as it tends towards the physical realm. Something there. Notice that quality, that grade. And now you'll work on that grade. First, hold that awareness. And then into that, if you can softly, gently open to the higher in aspiration. Or when you concentrate, or when you are in a deep state of deep meditation, concentration, from there, gently shift that influence into this layer, softening it. Or holding this layer, you read some passage of Savitri if it helps you to shift that state, and so on. The idea is now this layer is reasonably closed and not so open, at least to the higher influence. It doesn't have the familiarity which we were discussing earlier. And now you'll build that familiarity into this layer. And with that, and especially if you do this now before going to sleep, you'll find the tendency for this nightmare will immediately go away. Or the grade will shift, the quality will shift. Instead of nightmare, you'll have a different kind of experience. Nevertheless, recognize they are all happening in different parts. So the sense of continuity of consciousness that you're holding is happening in a different layer. The nightmare is in a different layer. There are even other layers that you might not be aware of, from which you don't recall when you return to the surface waking state. So comes the last part, which is the question about the concern or fear of going out of the body consciously. Do not worry about that, because when you actually go out of the body, it will not be in that grade of the lower vital where you have the nightmare. It will be in a different grade, much closer to the quality of the mental vital. And it'll be closer to the line of the thread which you're holding in the intention to maintain conscious awareness during sleep. So yes, not to worry, you can actually practice that also freely. But in a sense, at some point, these two practices will tend to blend. If you're able to hold this poise of continuity of consciousness somewhere, if you build the continuity in the inner, between that inner layer, inner thread and the surface, you have also the link by which you can shift into the poise in which the out-of-body experience can be held consciously. And the individuality forming there is also taking place through the exercises. So there are many things which you're doing or which you could do, and all of them will coalesce to give you the benefit that applies across all these things. So I think for today, we will pause with the questions and we go back to the text. The text which we've been following last time, and which took us into a very interesting and a very important part last time. You will remember Sri Aurobindo described there how the soul leaving the physical body passes through the subtle physical ranges first, then through the vital ranges, where strong tendencies are worked out. Even worlds are created and experienced which correspond to those tendencies and their need. And when those are exhausted, as if purged from your system, dissolved sufficiently, you move to the next, and eventually passing through the mental ranges. You, being not mind, must eventually settle into the thing which corresponds to the true you, which is the psychic being. And that, according to your level of evolution in the corresponding level of consciousness in what would be the psychic world. We read from Savitri some of this, what this world is like. But this passage I want to highlight. And all this he explains in the context of the necessity for evolution. For evolutionary purpose, we don't want to continue with the same personality that we last left. We want something totally different. And there is a necessity, therefore, to actually remove certain tendencies, to dissolve certain forms, impulses, drives, rearrange others, push some to the backdrop, bring others to the front, and so on, in order to form a new personality which is now necessary for the kind of life experience that you're preparing for. So the internatal passage, which Sri Aurobindo described, actually has a very complex process happening. And for this process to happen, that passage is absolutely essential. And the more complex that change is going to be, the more likely the time that you might need to spend for the shift. Or conversely, if you were to take birth very quickly, you would carry large parts of the imprints of the previous personality with you because you did not go through this process of restructuring. So I'm going to reread one little portion where he describes this restructuring. At each stage, he would exhaust and get rid of the fractions of formed personality structure, temporary and superficial, that belonged to the past life. He would cast off his mind sheath and life sheath, as he had already cast off his body sheath. But the essence of the personality of its mental, vital, and physical experiences would remain in a latent memory or as a dynamic potency for the future. So, a continuance of that action is necessary to shape and determine the progression of the mental and vital forms which our evolution takes in material nature. So here the key point was the inner is the more true real, where the repository of all life experiences is being held. The outer is the small tiny part which is at best carrying a small projected influence, and all experiences from the surface smallness are being registered in the inner, which is much larger. And so it's always the inner which will determine the outer. So, and I come to the line which I was looking for. There is an assimilation inside, a discarding and strengthening and rearranging of the old characters and motives, a new ordering of the developments of the past, and a selection for the purposes of the future, without which the new start cannot be fruitful or carry forward the evolution. So first is this assimilation, where what is new is, so to say, woven, blended into what was already present. Then there's a discarding, removal of things. Now this is no more needed, you drop this. Strengthening, you combine, you amplify, you intensify certain things. Rearranging. So now this was strong, that was put behind. Let's say vital force was stronger, mental intelligence was put as if behind. Now for the new, I will put mental intelligence forward and push the vital strength at the back. So rearranging in priorities of the old characters and motives. Earlier motive might have been to build the heroic capacity. The new motive might be to build the analytic appreciation through knowledge of the mind, for example. So a new ordering of the developments of the past and a selection for the purposes of the future. So you've reordered the past and then you've selected out of that what is relevant for the future. So all this is the critical thing for which this internatal passage becomes essential. For each birth is a new start. Rebirth is not a constant reiteration, but a progression. It is the machinery of an evolutionary process. So this, he highlights, part of this rearrangement, the discarding, especially of past strong vibrations of personality, can only be effected by an exhaustion of the push of previous mental, vital, physical motives after death. A part can only be done after death. Now, this is part I want to highlight. For each of those motives at the grade at which they are, you have to exhaust them in their corresponding grade of substance of worlds. Okay? But when you say part of it can only be exhausted after death, here's the suggestion that other parts can be exhausted even before death. Now think about what your life is like. Look back at your teenage years. Look at the impulses and drives that you had as a teenager, or even pre-teenage. And then you lost those. They were no more interesting. Then in your teenage years, some things became extremely important to you. And then those faded out and something else came and took place, which became more important to you, and so on. And so with what we call maturing of personality, certain intensities of drives which become almost exclusive to the point of overwhelming everything else, those are now subdued. They are better integrated. For example, as a teenager, you suddenly get overwhelmed with passion or what feels at that point like a love impulse. And at that moment, we see so many people in life just say, this is it, this is my life's purpose, and I will stop my education and go and marry such and such person. And the parents will plead, oh, please continue, complete your education. You don't understand how life will be. No, I don't need to understand. This is it. That's the extent of that tiny part being exaggerated and overwhelming the whole personality. But when that passes, when the integration has been sufficiently made, the tiny part now finds its rightful place integrated with the rest. When next this impulse happens, you don't get as overwhelmed. Yes, I know what it feels like, and it's no more as overwhelming, and it's better integrated. So every new experience that comes up at various stages of our lives momentarily may tend to overwhelm, but increasingly as the integration is better done, we find less and less of overwhelming, more and more of the adaptation and integration with all other parts as the experience grows. And such is the description of a maturer personality, or at least maturing in that part. That being the case, notice how in our normal life, we actually go through this purgatory process where we work out certain tendencies, and then having largely overpassed them, we move on with other, newer, higher possibilities. There's a particular phrase, and I've used this phrase now almost deliberately. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, overpassed. I do not recall the exact wording of the letter, where somebody from Gujarat had written to him with specific questions about what to do with these kinds of impulses which rise. And Sri Aurobindo's advice was, these things have to be sometimes gone through, but quickly overpassed. You have to go through that experience. Otherwise, that integration would never happen, but quickly overpassed. So you make that transition as short as possible. Don't wallow too long. Don't get stuck in it thinking this is it. Know that it's just a passage, and overpassed, the word is very suggestive. You pass over. You come to a grade of consciousness which is higher, which includes this. You're not suppressing or blocking anything. It includes this, but now placed in its rightful relation with a higher reference, which holds it all together. And so in the yoga, inevitably, And especially when we're looking at people who enter the yoga at a younger age, you will go through various stages of certain passages of drives, impulses, desires, instincts, which may come up at various stages. And then as they come, you know that you have to go through and overpass. How brief or the nature of that passage may differ from person to person depending on your need and personality types. Nevertheless, the experience itself, well, it's there and it's important. It represents a part in your nature which now needs to be integrated or even to be developed and integrated. So go through, overpass as quickly as possible. As far as possible, cling to the larger sense of life purpose and aspiration, despite you feeling overwhelmed in that moment. So this is a very important point I want to bring to attention, because it's left almost as a suggestion. Part of this rearrangement, the discarding especially of past strong vibrations of personality, can only be effected by an exhaustion of the push of previous mental, vital, physical motives after death. So part can only be done after death. Why? Because certain things our physical life does not allow enough time or energy or circumstances for. I'd given examples last time of things which none of us could have as circumstances. You want to be a hero of the national level award for something, whatever it is. You're a sportsman, you wanted to come first in the Olympics, whatever your ambition was. You can never exhaust that in your real life because the circumstances are not available. Or it can be that the nature of the drive demands something far too intense than what your capacity would be. So that would be another reason. And so there could be many reasons why in the physical life you don't have enough time or energy to take up those things. If I had, let's say, all the time in the world, I might have just dedicated myself to learning 2 or 3 new languages and going in depth in them and working upon exploring Sri Aurobindo's theory of language and his linguistic work. Just don't have the time. The interest is there in a part of the mind. And if that interest were strong enough, compelling, it could even disrupt certain priorities here, but I'll still never get enough time to do that. So there's always a compromise. But in the transition after life, after death, if that part was strong enough, it would say, now I need to dedicate myself and complete this as much as I can, for example. So there are things, he said, which can only be exhausted after death. And these are the parts. But others can be done during life, and that's part of the nature of life itself. And this internatal liberation or lightening of the impedimenta, of the things which block the impediments, must be put through on the planes proper to the motives that are to be discarded or otherwise manipulated. Those planes which are themselves of that nature. So you have to go through those worlds and those planes to work out those things. Again, there's very subtle suggestion. I didn't go too much into detail last time because we wanted to complete the text, where he says, you have to go through the planes proper to the motives that are to be discarded or otherwise manipulated. Again, here is a very profound suggestion. Pause here and really think about it. There are certain motives which you want to discard. They've served their purpose. Now they have no value. But there are other motives which are not to be discarded, but there's a truth in them which you want to keep. Those you want to join and merge and somehow give its proper place. Let's take this example of somebody who's fallen in love, holding that, the idealism, it doesn't work out in real life, as we know always. And yet that thing, that truth of it stays. What is its place? And now it is integrated and put in right relation as part of the psychic relation of the love that it experiences to the divine and turns to the divine presence in others. And this is the otherwise manipulated option. There was a truth to it. You don't want to just discard and say, this thing is unreal, impossible, pointless, distraction. No, there's a truth. Bring it in alignment, discover what it is. There'll be other things which may come like strong impulse of vengeance or hate or wanting to harm another. These you would discard. You'd say, okay, it served its purpose at that time as part of learning to control and redirect my emotions and energies. Now that is no more needed. There's a pure discardation. But manipulated is when there is this modifying, giving it right direction, right purpose, putting it in context, and integrating with the rest. So discarded or otherwise manipulated. But on that plane. Now, in the physical life, it's very difficult to exercise on that plane alone. Again, we take an example. Let's say somebody has a strong fear associated with a certain activity or object. Each time the fear comes up in physical life, it overwhelms everything. Your mind, vital, physical, and everything goes into instability. Your heart rate goes up, your physical health is affected, you cannot sleep, your mind is clouded, and so on. But when you are in the transitory stage internatally, the fear experience is held in the vital proper, and you experience the fear with an intensity which is 100 or 1,000 times more because it's in the pure vital, without the dulling effect of the physical body, and without the, let's say, overwhelming impact that it has in your normal life routine, and the disruption it would have to your normal life. Without the responsibility of that, you can indulge in the fear with full intensity and go over it any number of times over days, weeks, months, years, if you want, with all the variations you want to create, until you're able to exhaust, to purge or modify or bring it under control or mastery, or simply say, now I've woken up, it's no more needed, I discard and move on. So the benefit of that plane and the time spent in that plane is also great, where you can completely exhaust. So again, I come to a few words he uses. For it is only there that the soul can still continue the activities which have to be exhausted and rejected from the consciousness, so that it can pass on to a new formation. It is only there that you can do this. You can't do that really in the physical world for those things, for a few of those things. So you understand the importance of that passage. Having understood this, I'm going to suggest something which comes today with a certain benefit that we have with technology, and which I've personally found very helpful also. I had briefly alluded to it last time in passing. The utility of narrations and of cinema. Sri Aurobindo has a great discussion about this, and he refers to the Greek concept of catharsis, where you identify, let's take a live play. On stage, you're watching characters go through the grief and the struggle and the anger and the vengeance, or whatever, and the loves and the intensities of whatever emotions and passions. Today, much more easily done in your own home, in cinema, on a screen. But when you identify, but a part of you is not responsible for the consequences, you have the added benefit that you can indulge in the experience while still remaining out of it partly. So with this partial indulgence, you can often exhaust certain tendencies to a great extent, if done in the right way with that intention. So you'll see, for example, when children go through that phase of romantic awakening, they'll want to watch romantic movies, they'll want to indulge in romantic songs, and they'll wallow in that kind of a mood and amplify, intensify those states. But once you've as if passed across, you look back and say, yes, yeah, it was nice, but no more relevant. And so adults look at their children now going through that phase and say, yes, you're going through that. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, have fun. Eventually, you will outgrow it. So there's this experience one can easily now accelerate or intensify and rapidly pass through and overpass, to use Sri Aurobindo's vocabulary, and experience this quickly. So there's a benefit here. And this can be a very powerful tool when correctly used for purpose of the sadhana in developing certain aspects of your nature and your temperament. Equally, one can use it to amplify certain aspects of your nature and temperament. In this case, let's take a positive character, something of the aspect of heroism and courage, or strength and selfless, self-giving, and so on. These also, through appropriate use of cinema, can be of great help. It is for this reason that mostly you will find well-made documentaries or historical cinema are more helpful than something which is largely constructed from someone's imagination. Or when they draw heavily on the reality of life while weaving a good story, then you'll find you have the necessary useful raw materials upon which to be able to build and intensify certain kinds of experiences. So in a sense, that's what you're doing in the internatal passage, where you're reliving or experiencing, creating your own world, your own cinema, 3D immersive realities to go through, except you could do that with a less 3D immersive experience using the right kind of drama, story narration, or cinema. It is probable also that the integrating positive preparations would be carried out and the character of the new life would be decided by the soul itself in a resort to its native habitat. So this is the final integration that takes place. So again, here I'm going to suggest this as an active utility for those who would like to do that. When you watch a cinema or a play or a narration of a story like this, and there has been this strong, heroic, courageous movement, you've felt it, you have lived it partially in the identification. Take a moment to step back. Draw upon that imprint of the courage and heroism that you've experienced and let that assimilate into you. When that is sufficiently settled, then turn to the circumstances of your life and let it give itself its new form appropriate to your current life. Think about what that would do. It's an equivalent of the psychic being withdrawing in its state of rest for the assimilation and turning to the new life. It's something of that movement replicated here as part of the conscious process of the catharsis or the new learning and absorption of experience. And if you think about it in this way, you'll see the tremendous power and utility it can have for forming and developing certain aspects of your personality. So I think I will pause with this here. And before we go to the next part of the passage, the next paragraph, which is extremely important. And after that, we will move to the main theme, which is how do you carry over this continuity of consciousness. So broadly, this is going to be the last part. Before we take this up, I want to read actually from some of the letters of Sri Aurobindo. This would be the best time, while what we have read is fresh as a broad structure of what happens and why it happens. We read what Sri Aurobindo has to say in his letters to questions about this transition. So the theme for today I have put as a subtitle, the psychic choices. And the first letter of Sri Aurobindo goes thus. The psychic being at the time of death chooses what it will work out in the next birth and determines the character and conditions of the new personality. Life is for the evolutionary growth by experience in the conditions of the ignorance till one is ready for the higher light. So we don't know what the question was. Sri Aurobindo has answered this. But what he has answered has something very important. At the time of death, the psychic being chooses what it will work out in the next birth. So already that choice of what you're going to do next is made then and determines the character and conditions of the new personality. Now this is so important. The character that you will have, the conditions of that new personality are determined here. They are decided. It's not as if, oh, something in that direction. This is what I want. That's the decision. This is so important. So we'll have this, an elaboration of this in the next letter. Sri Aurobindo again is replying, we don't know to what question. The dying wish of the man is only something on the surface. It may be determined by the psychic and so help to shape the future, but it does not determine the psychic's choice. So the dying wish could be determined by the psychic, but the dying wish does not determine the psychic's choice. So it's an inside out. Always the psychic choice comes forward. Okay. So the psychic choice, what is it? That is something behind the veil. It is not the outer consciousness's action that determines the inner process, but the other way around. The inner is determining the outer. So even let's say an example of a person who's about to leave and he says, oh, I wish I had done this. Oh, I want to do that. It could be a pure fancy on the surface, having nothing to do with the psychic choice. But there can also be reflections or leaking out of the psychic that he describes next. Sometimes, however, there are signs or fragments of the inner action that come up on the surface. For example, some people have a vision or remembrance of the circumstances of their past in a panoramic flash at the time of death. That is the psychic's review of the life before departing. So you've all read of people at the time of near-death experiences in a moment, as if there is the full span of the life in a single moment. Every tiny detail is as if seen and known in a flash, and a decision made. Am I ready to leave or not? So observe this. He says, is the psychic's review of the life before departing. This experience takes place in the psychic consciousness. It does not take place in the surface mind and emotions or surface personality. But because it's taking place in the psychic, it reflects from there. If at that moment the psychic has come forward and taken charge of the situation to make a choice, do I stay or go? And it's come forward with a certain intensity, with a choice to be made, the reflection of that experience will stay in the memory of the surface mind or not. For those who remember, it's there. For those who do not remember, maybe they were aware and lost the memory, or they were so turned on the surface they were not even conscious of this. But this always happens. So it is in the psychic consciousness, the panoramic flash at the time of death. That is the psychic's review of the life before departing. And it is in that review that the psychic then turns and chooses what's next. So in this case of the near-death experience, the choice to continue or leave. In the case of a formal decision to go, the choice of what the next is going to be. So this is what we will see in the next letter. Sri Aurobindo writes, the psychic being's choice at the time of death doesn't work out the next formation of personality. It fixes it. So very subtle distinction between working out the next formation of personality and fixing the next formation of personality. The choice made at the time of death fixes the formation of personality. So we continue. When it enters the psychic world, it begins to assimilate the essence of its experience, and by that assimilation is formed the future psychic personality in accordance with the fixation already made. So you see how important that point is of that transition. At the point where you're leaving the body, you look ahead and there's a fixation of the personality. It's fixed now. Then the work done of assimilation and preparation of the personality is in accordance to what was fixed. For that, you need that rest in the psychic world. But the fixation was made right then. You understand how important that point is at the time of leaving the body. Okay. When this assimilation is over, it is ready for a new birth. So the time needed depends entirely on how much time it needs to make this shift. So if the shift is complex, taking more time, well, you stay waiting more time until this is done. When it's done, it's as if that which was fixed at the time of death now is the imprint along which the future personality formation is being developed while in the psychic rest. When that is completed, automatically at the completion, the movement for the next birth begins. At least it is ready for the new birth. But not all can do this consciously. So for the new birth. So he explains, but the less developed beings do not work out the whole thing for themselves. There are beings and forces of the higher world who have that work. So remember, we have spoken of degrees of individualization and maturing and organization of the psychic being and the psychic personality. And if that has not been sufficiently done, then you have beings whose job it is to help you and even to make the shifts necessary. Also, when it comes to birth, it is not sure that the forces of the physical world will not come across the working out of what is wanted. So you may choose. So you say, all right, I had a heroic life. Now I'm going to go into a poetic life and have a comfortable focus in poetry. It may not always happen in the material circumstances. There may be forces which will come to block it or derail it. Just because you chose it doesn't mean it has to happen in the way that you wanted it. So he warns about this. The forces of the physical world may come across the working out of what is wanted. Its own new instrumentation may not be strong enough for that purpose. Okay, let's now reverse the thing. You were a poet and now you want to become a warrior. So now you're trying to push forward this strong, vital strength aspect of heroism, courage, etc. But when the challenge comes, your instrumentation may not be strong enough to manage this. You may want to dedicate yourself to a spiritual life, but when you actually enter the physical world and the circumstances and the strong influences of education and family and the compulsion of circumstances, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough this or that or whatever it is, and those drives which come up, they could overwhelm. So its own new instrumentation may not be strong enough for that purpose. So you have come with the intention, but the other things overwhelm and you're unable to hold your own against the overwhelming forces. He explains, for there is the interaction of its own energies and the cosmic forces here, that is in the physical world. So you may have come with something as an intention. Your capacity may be insufficient and you will struggle now against the resistance of circumstances. And what's the consequence? He says, there may be frustration, diversion, a partial working out. Many things may happen. And I'm going to focus on these three words from the perspective of the spiritual aspirants for all of us. And I'm going to assume this, and I think with reasonable surety, that all of us who are reading this, watching this, or enjoying this kind of a content have come on earth with a certain choice for a spiritual purpose, direction, intention, life, without exception. There may be variations in details, but we've come with this. Otherwise, you wouldn't find spending 2 hours reading, studying, talking about these things to be interesting. If it is nourishing to you, then you are meant for this, very simply. All of us having come with that, these are the three things that could happen. There may be frustration. Things come up and block repeatedly. And I'm unable to do what I want to do. I may have come with an intention to create a great work of art. Again and again, various kinds of frustrations come. Opportunities lost, things coming in the way, problems, lack of finance, lack of opportunity, lack of circumstance. Many things could happen. Or even active forces coming to block. But in the spiritual context, the frustrations, be very careful. The second thing is diversions. So I came with this intention, suddenly something seizes me with such an overwhelming force that I have to now fulfill that before I can come back to the spiritual purpose. Be very careful about that. Sometimes it could simply be a compulsion of priority of funds. Let's say, I want to do that, but I must earn so much before I can do that. I remember somebody who said this, it was in a different context, but there's something he wanted to do. He wanted to get married. He said, before I can get married, I must earn so much and stand on my feet. And he gave a number. It was a large number. So obviously, the first question was, why this number? Why not 10% less? It was just arbitrary. But the fixation of the mind was so strong, until this happens, I will not even think about the next. And the result was missed opportunities. But on the other hand, if something like this happens in the direction of your spiritual aspiration, it can be a major loss. Perhaps there was nothing significant, perhaps, I don't know. But in this case, in terms of spiritual loss, the loss of a dozen years or more, just because you decided you had to first earn enough money before you could dedicate yourself to the spiritual growth, is a heavy loss. Because the sooner you start, the younger you are, the more plastic you are, the more open and receptive and malleable your consciousness, your personality, the less damaged, the less compromised, the less distorted by suffering and other distortions, the easier it is. Start sooner is better. Do not think in terms of when I retire. That never works. But my point here is, do not let things come in the way which might divert you. Even if the compulsion is strong, in this case, let's say you need to earn money, well, do put the spiritual practice at the same time in equal priority, or even in slightly higher priority than the earning money. While you earn the money, do your spiritual work. Even if you don't earn enough, it's not important. This is important. And if you cling to this, the rest will be helped. You will be helped by circumstances because you're pursuing your life's soul's aspiration. The circumstances will tend to pull, to shape, to support that. If instead you allow the diversion and chase after that distraction and say the rest will follow or is incidental to this, then you will find very quickly things beginning to peter out, fizzle out, because you're misaligning from the soul's aspiration. And then the spontaneous nature of things coming to help tends to weaken. Or even the contrary, things might happen. And keep in mind, especially when you're talking of frustration and diversion, there are actively forces which want to do this to you. They want to frustrate your spiritual destiny. They want to divert you from your spiritual destiny. And so many cases we have known in the ashram where people were led astray because of such things. I've given the example of Romain Palit, and I hope nobody's hurt by that. He's long gone. He's the one who we have referred to Sri Aurobindo pointing to him and showing how within 2 years he suddenly has a flowering out of all his artistic abilities. He becomes a musician. He plays the sitar. He plays the tabla. He sings beautifully. He writes extraordinary poetry. His literary faculties have suddenly opened up. And in 2 years, where he had nothing. And Sri Aurobindo says, you cannot explain this except by the action of the yoga force. And at some point, I don't know the details, but this is what I was told when I was much younger. He had some strong, passionate call, and he chose to leave the ashram and get married to somebody who was the complete contrary to what he was. She was a strong, vital character type. He suffered much. Eventually, he did come back to the ashram with her. And as a child, I met them often. So I have the impression of what it was. And the woman was a terror, absolutely the complete contrary of anything that he might have been nourishing for him. In any case, what we saw afterwards was a shell. The man had lost the momentum of the work. By then, Sri Aurobindo had left his body and things were not the same anymore. But he still lived in the memory of that. And we could see that when he wrote things, there's a certain beauty and power to it. But the force of that momentum was gone. And this woman leached upon him in a way that ruined him. And it was a serious diversion and disruption, frustration of his spiritual destiny. And the third, which is a variation on this, a partial working out. The partial working out, of course, inevitably, if there is a strong soul aspiration, something has to happen, but it could be partial. And again, it need not always be in the spiritual context. You could be in the context of heroic courage and warrior consciousness that you want to develop and still have a partial working out because of reasons. I'm focusing much more on the spiritual because that's our priority right now for all of us. But you must understand the text is generally about anything that the soul had chosen as its line of development, and it might end up with a partial working out. Many things may happen, Sri Aurobindo says. All that is not a rigid machinery. It is a working out of complex forces. It may be added, however, that a developed psychic being is much more conscious in this transition and works much of it out itself. So remember earlier he said that when the psychic being is not sufficiently developed, there are beings and forces of the higher worlds who do that work, helping in the assimilation and helping to direct the next birth and so on. There are beings who are formed out of the psychic substance, who are in the nature of the psychic world, representatives of what the psychic world has to do in relation to the souls, to the psychic beings. They have no interest in material affairs. They have no interest in the physical world. Their job is only in assisting this process of the psychic assimilation and preparation for the life. So when the psychic being is more developed and more conscious, then this transition, it works out by itself mostly. Still, it might be supported. The time depends also on the development and on a certain rhythm of the being. For some, there is practically immediate rebirth. For others, it takes longer. For some, it may take centuries. But here again, once the psychic being is sufficiently developed, it is free to choose its own rhythm and its own intervals. So we come back to the original idea that we've been highlighting from the beginning of this particular theme that we've taken up, the freedom of choice of the psychic being. Obviously, this freedom is more completely exercised when it is more developed. But even when it is less developed, it is a freedom assisted by the beings whose job it is to help. Their freedom or their choice, perhaps combining in it. But the two words he has used here, which are of great significance, choose its own rhythm and its own intervals. And this sense of rhythm, he's used earlier in the same line. The time, how much time internatal, depends on the development and on a certain rhythm of the being. What is this rhythm of the being that he's referring to? And for this, you have to really go deep into the sense of the psychic being as it looks ahead to its unfolding line of development across lives. There's a work to be done, and there's a broad line distinct and unique to its existence itself. It's put out from the supreme divine consciousness for a certain line of development and experience, and so carries something common across all the lives. While there may be all kinds of variations in the content and prioritizing across different lives, there's still something common which links it all. In that overall unfolding, remember, in the consciousness which is eternal, the eternal meeting time or entering the domain of time, how does it represent itself? By kind of a rhythming, a spontaneous rhythming. And the nature of the rhythm would correspond to the particular quality of vibration of its sense of purpose and its line of development. So, for example, now going into specifics. If for a particular psychic being, the line of working corresponds to something which has to do with a certain rapidity and a certain haste in the working out and the way it works out, going into details, working out specifics. And if that is the overall quality of the theme, the rhythms would have that characteristic. If for somebody else, the overall theme is to rest in eternity while expressing itself or aspects of eternity in its creations and in its experiences, then the rhythm might be much more slow and long and gradual in certain respects. Still having an overall rhythm, it might have phases of rhythm. Now I really need to accelerate. There's a huge opportunity coming up. Okay, let's take a real example. Let's say about 2,000 years ago, or maybe more, 3,000 years ago, when this opportunity was already felt by the seeing soul, that there's going to come this crisis of evolution. There's going to come this point of transition where humanity will as if be pushed to break out of the limits of the intellect and open to higher spiritual possibility and prepare for the emergence of a new race. And you see already nature preparing for that leap. Remember, Mother said it took nature 2,000 years to gather the material necessary for her body, not just biology, but subtle gradations of body. And she needed 6 months to put back if she had to leave her body, to give back to nature what was gathered. What does it mean, 2,000 years? That means 2,000 years before, at least, this time was known, and this opportunity was known. Maybe not exactly down to specific years, but broadly, somewhere around there, 2,000 years from now. And the other souls who are also aligned to this, they see this coming huge opportunity, huge event, massive event in Earth's spiritual history. Wow, I need to align to that. Again, depending on how conscious the soul is. I need to align to that, and a rhythm is set in relation to that key transition point. 2, 3, 4 rhythms of life. And what do I need to prepare for this? This experience, this. That's it. That's your rhythm set. Broadly, broad strokes. And each of those lives, again, the timing may shift depending on opportunities at that time. But broadly, the line of work developed would be set already to some degree. So 2,000 years ago, one could have said, at that point, I will be choosing to do this or that more or less. Which for some of them actually included being physically present in the presence and the circumstances of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, or at least being on earth at that time when this work is happening, so that you can fully align to the power of that tremendous downpour of the spiritual possibilities, working out the new world in a new consciousness, to be on earth at that time. So you get a sense of what he means by the rhythm. The time depends also on the development and on a certain rhythm of the being. Okay. Then he continues with the letter. The ordinary theories are too mechanical. And that is the case also with the idea of punya and papa, virtue and sin, and their results in the next life. There are certain results of the energies put forth in a past life, but not on that rather infantile principle. And he gives examples. A good man's suffering in this life would be proof, according to orthodox theory, that he had been a great villain in past life, etc. So we'll skip that. We've discussed this topic. And he comments, too symmetrical to be true. Interesting comment. It's a general comment. Something is too symmetrical to be true. In reality, in nature, you will not find this precise symmetry. So whenever you see that, you know it's not natural and it's not true. Then he explains the object of birth being growth by experience. Whatever reactions come to past deeds must be for the being to learn and grow. Not as lollipops for the good boys of the class in the past and canings for the bad ones. The real sanction for good and ill is not good fortune for the one and bad fortune for the other, but this, that the good leads us towards a higher nature, which is eventually lifted above suffering and above suffering. And ill pulls us towards the lower nature, which remains always in the circle of suffering and evil. So if at all you have to think in terms of reward for virtue, etc., it's not so much that, it's that when you do the good, your consciousness grows more and more until it lifts above that domain where you suffer. When you do ill, you tend to be pulled into your lower nature more and more and wallow in the circle of that suffering and evil. It's not as a reward or punishment, it's a consequence in your evolution. So people, for example, who have deliberately caused suffering to others during the life, the consciousness in which you can do that is a low consciousness. You have to either slide into that, or in doing that, you are sliding into it unintentionally. I've had this many times with certain people who keep coming up. That person caused me so much pain. I am going to take my vengeance. Now think about how that works. For superficially, it means, okay, I'll do my vengeance, I'll make that person suffer, and it's over. So I had to tell the person, I said, when you do that, observe your state now. The state in which you want to have that vengeance, this intensity of hate or anger, you're wallowing in it. The more you will work for and plan for that vengeance, the more you will wallow in this. The more you will identify with this. Without that, you will not feel the need for vengeance. So you're actually choosing to slip into a lower grade. Meanwhile, that person has moved on, is not even conscious that he or she may have caused you distress. That person is happy because they don't even know. You got hurt and now you want to have vengeance, and you're putting yourself in deeper mess of pain and suffering. Which would you rather have? Wallow in suffering for no reason at all? Or would you rather simply move on and say, okay, that was whatever it was, let me make the most of the situation and move on, and be happy in a space which is for you more fulfilling and growth oriented? That's the difference that the good and evil, so to say, will make. By wallowing in this, not only you will be sucked down into lower and lower gradations of consciousness until your consciousness is bound deeply, and of course with the consequences after you leave the body, with consequences into the next life and so on, or you've moved on and overpassed this struggle, and you're able to live in a clearer consciousness with the consequences after the leaving the body and into the next life. It's always in terms of evolutionary growth. And that's all that is important from the spiritual perspective. So we go to another letter of Sri Aurobindo, which is also, certain elements are repeated, but there are insights which you will find helpful here. He says, the soul, after it leaves the body, travels through several states or planes until the psychic being has shed its temporary sheaths. Then it reaches the psychic world, where it rests in a kind of sleep till it is ready for reincarnation. Okay, so one sentence is summarized what we have been reading in great depth in the Life Divine. And you see how, had you read only this letter, you would have no idea of all the complexity of knowledge which he has revealed in the life divine. In a kind of sleep. So people say, ah, yes, sleep. No, it's not. Kind of is not sleep. Till it is ready for reincarnation. Then, what it keeps with it of the human experience in the end is only the essence of all that it has gone through. What it can use for its development. This is the general rule. But it does not apply to exceptional cases or to very developed beings who have achieved a greater consciousness than the ordinary human level. So we look at some of these exceptional cases and the very developed beings. In their case, they may not retain just the essence, they may retain much more. For example, they may not have to go through all those different steps. They may bypass or modify some of the things in the developed freedom that they've acquired. So the general rule is that a general rule. It does not apply for these exceptional or developed cases. Then he explains, it is not the soul, the psychic being, that takes a lesser form in its next birth. It is some part of the manifested being, usually some part of the vital, that does it, owing to some desire, affinity, need of particular experience. This happens fairly often to the ordinary man. So the idea was, it would have been in the question, that why is it that after a person has passed on, something of that person sometimes is attached to some animal or some bird, etc. We have spoken about this before. So he says it is a part of that being, generally some part of the vital that does that because of strong desire, affinity, or need of particular experience. Let's say at the time of death, the person has not had proper food because they were going through severe treatment, they had to go through special diets, but all their life they had strong cravings and gluttonous tendencies, or at least gourmet tendencies of appreciating good food. They felt denied. And now this vital part, which is craving good food, which was denied because of the medical treatment or denial of sugar because you had diabetes or whatever it was. That craving part says, ah, yes, now I'm going to fulfill myself, and attaches itself in the grade of consciousness that it is at, because it's being shed in the vital. Remember, the vital body is being shed and it decomposes. These naughty parts may stay, and it attaches to an animal that corresponds to that grade. And through the drive of that animal, fulfills itself. Or, it's interesting, and I'm going to give this as an example also. Strong sexual needs or tendencies may attach themselves to other humans or animals. And it's interesting, I've read this quite commonly in popular literature. Very often when people have gone to cemeteries or grounds where somebody was buried or cremated and they come back, very often it's a habit that they have strong sexual urges. Why? Because they went into that space where all these fragments of drives, of desires were hanging around. They went into that space, it latched on to them and fulfilled itself through you. Interesting. Think about it. Think about how much we are catching from environments that we go to where these things could be hanging around, or where we are available to them and they latch on to you. Interesting observation. It's the reason why in India they're very careful when they go to these kinds of spaces. Women are never allowed. It's only the men who will go. They're generally more hard. And especially you never know when a woman might be pregnant or might be preparing, might have just conceived. You don't want lower vibrations to latch onto them. This is just to give you an idea of the complexities that might be involved in these types of fragmentation. But the point Sri Aurobindo makes, owing to some desire, affinity, or need of particular experience, he says this happens fairly often to the ordinary man. So we could say a large part of humanity actually has lots of these kinds of knots which are put out, which attach to other beings for fulfillment. Again, we come to another letter which has some interesting elements which will also help us to understand. After leaving the body, the soul, after certain experiences in other worlds, throws off its mental and vital personality and goes to rest to assimilate the essence of its past and prepare for a new life. Same thing. It is this preparation that determines the circumstances of the new birth and guides it in its reconstitution of a new personality and the choice of its materials. Okay, again, we are familiar with these ideas. Now comes the memory aspect. The departed soul retains the memory of its past experiences only in their essence, not in their form or detail. It is only if the soul brings back some past personality or personalities as part of its present manifestation that it is likely to remember the details of the past life. Otherwise, it is only by the yoga drishti, yogic vision, that the memory comes. So now we have a very interesting insight into past life memories. Generally, it's the essence. And then, if some significant portion of the previous personality has been retained and brought forward, then elements of the memories associated with that substance which experienced it, that stays. Otherwise, it is only by the yogic vision that the memory comes, and that can be very detailed. So I'll share here a personal experience, and I don't think I'm breaking any sense of confidentiality or trust in sharing this, because I think it will be helpful for everyone to value it. I've very often here recommended books of Mark O'Byrne, but also of Dina Merriam. And Dina Merriam is one of those who has had vivid, detailed memories of prior lives. When she first shared these memories with me, and I'd encouraged her to write them in books, and I'm so glad it has happened. But when she first narrated them, it was very distinct in this particular pattern that only the essence, peak moments where the psychic being came forward in those lives, those were remaining. So in one particular case, for example, she remembered only the entire life dedicated in service of a spiritual teacher. And she was living in a small hut. Every day it was concentrating on serving him and serving him and serving him. And certain overall imprints generally held. Certain details corresponding to that, that's about all. So at that point, you can ask, where was it? And she will have a general impression, somewhere as if in that part of the world. And that's about all. You cannot get specifics of names and details in that state. In another case, she had the memory of being as the maid to Sita of the Ramayana. And when Sita went to Rama's house, they had to maintain the flame. And especially when she left for the forest, she had to maintain the flame. It's all that the soul memory retains. The yearning, the aspiration, the memory of that waiting. Later, what is interesting is when she began to write of these experiences, while concentrating on the life and entering into it, details of the life began to emerge. And sometimes rich details, including certain events and conversations in rich detail, almost like a story narration. And at that point, she said, it's as if I'm tapping into the Akashic records of those events. So there's a very clear difference between the soul memory as carried by the soul itself, and then this consciousness turning to the soul memory and tuning into those events and now perceiving through what Sri Aurobindo has described here, yoga drishti, the yogic vision, which draws out further rich details. And the overall sense of purity of those perceptions, again, I vouch for, otherwise I don't recommend that book, those books. But for those of you who would like to, certainly do look at her first book, starting with her first book. And it is available on Amazon. And My Journey Across Lives, I think it's the name of the Dina Merriam. So in this case, you had these two memories, and the distinction of these two, I was able to witness when she was writing, when she was drawing upon those memories, because I was present sometimes when she was writing. I could see the state in which she was and the way the memories were flowing. So it was very interesting to observe that, as distinct from the pure soul memory in what it retains and carries over. And what it carried over had the purity of the soul's absorption of experience of that life, and the way it shapes her life today, and even shapes elements in her personality today. It was so visible. I had, and I'm saying this because it gives you a real life example, but also something you can then read in the book and refer to, and you'll feel the way it works. In the book itself, she has taken trouble to show the connections across those lives and how it has influenced her work in this life, sometimes the memory when she met people who she had worked with in the past, and the imprint returning here. In one particular case, which is quite amazing, it just shows you how powerful some of these influences can be across lives. I'm sharing this as that example. It related to something which she has as an unusual interest in this life of wanting to collect crystals, and special crystals of various kinds. So in her house, you have all these crystals of different kinds. Looking at them, one can see they've been carefully selected. There's a certain quality of energy or power associated with the crystal, or some aesthetic aspect to it, but they've been carefully selected. They're not just anything which looks nice. And then at some point, in part because of some connection I had, we met with somebody who had just passed on, but in whom she recognized through the photo and the space where he was, she recognized as somebody who had been a teacher briefly for her in one of their lives. And she remembered him teaching her how to see the light inside the crystals. And then one day, suddenly, he just left and never came back, and she was left hanging. That's all the impression with regard to him from that particular life. But the link to the crystals and the yearning for the crystals came. Now, this again, I'm going to validate in a different way, because when we were there in his space, a photograph of him was brought. And she looked at the photograph and immediately was pulled into a deep state of trance. And this happened again and again. Finally, the people began to laugh. They said, every time we show you his photo, you go into a deep state of trance. And I asked her what it was. She was pulled back into the state which corresponded to something received and developed in that life during the work with him. I'm giving this as an example of how deep and how important some of these imprints and influences can be in their effect, in their impact across lives. The recognitions that can come sometimes from these things, and how valuable and important they can be, how powerful they would be, especially when it relates to the soul's evolution and the spiritual evolution. It would not be if it was just, so she had memories of people with whom she was married, romance, etc. They don't have any value. But when there's a strong spiritual imprint, a spiritual transmission, a spiritual experience, those things have real value for the soul, isn't it? So even with the crystal, the connection was because there was a spiritual link to them. The perception of the light within the crystals, or the spiritual presence, or the tuning into something, but it related to something in the soul's aspiration, and so that was retained as a almost like a hobby to gather crystals for no reason that she could find in this particular life, until that memory came, and yes, that was it. That's what it was. So we continue. From the memory, he spoke of the other memory which comes from the yogic vision. There may be what seem to be retrograde movements in the evolution of the soul. But these are only like zigzag movements, not a real falling back, but a return on something not worked out so as to go on better afterwards. So it can happen. It's not as if having gone to a stage, you'll fall back to prior stage because you did good or bad. It's nothing to do with that. It's as if some work which was done partially now is taken up from where it was done and developed for a better integration or a better amplification, or now with a better opportunity, something which was left either frustrated or derailed or partially done, taken up again to be completed now in better circumstances. So the soul does not go back to the animal condition. Someone would have asked these questions, can you go back? But part of the vital personality may disjoin itself and join an animal birth to work out its animal propensities there. So this is what we discussed earlier. Part of the vital personality as it is shed, and the personality disintegrating, those elements which are strongly formed could attach. There is no truth in the popular belief about the avaricious man becoming a serpent. These are popular romantic superstitions. So Sri Aurobindo dismisses all that straight away. We come to one more letter. Many elements are repeated, so I'm just trying to see how much to read. Okay, let's just do it. The soul takes birth each time And each time a mind, life, and body are formed out of the materials of universal nature, according to the soul's past evolution and its need for the future. So it's as if you're gathering material in the mental domain, in the vital domain, and then the physical material. Well, you can't gather because physical matter is too rigid. You have to use the biological birth process to find gathered material that you can plug into. But in the vital and mental bodies, you simply gather material and construct your body according to the past evolution, what you're able to wield, and the need for the future. Now, there's a very important point, subtlety here. Let's say, we'll take the example of the mind. In the mind, there are gradations of refinement and abstraction, even of complexities of abstraction. But if you have not developed those, your mind is largely an emotional mind in your evolutionary stages of past lives development. When you begin to gather mind material, you have only ability to draw upon some of this which is familiar to you. Even if you gathered material which was not familiar to you by some force of will, you might not have the ability to hold it or wield it or use it. But the purpose of the soul's intention in this life might be precisely to go beyond its emotional mind and develop this pure abstraction of the mental substance and powers of mind. So it may actually draw some of that with a certain force of will. And then in the incarnation, work now to build, develop, integrate, form, and otherwise construct the higher faculties of the mind and develop their powers. But the ability to do that would not be there in the initial gathering of the material. It will still be helped because that is the intention. There'll be beings who will infuse and join that to you. And then in the life itself, you'll be drawing upon that. So according to the soul's past evolution, you have capacities. And then according to the need for the future, you may choose. So that's material gathered. When the body is dissolved, the vital goes into the vital plane and remains there for a time. But after a time, the vital sheath disappears. The last to dissolve is the mental sheath. Finally, the soul or psychic being retires into the psychic world to rest there till a new birth is due. So we have all studied all this now, so we don't... This is the general course for ordinary developed human beings. There are variations according to the nature of the individual and his development. For example, if the mental is strongly developed, then the mental being can remain. To form the mental individuality and developed it, built into it a great, rich capacity and developed its faculties and powers. Well, you will retain a large part of that. So it won't be fully shed, it won't be fully dissolved. Then the mental being can remain. So also the vital, provided they are organized by and centered around the true psychic being. So a critical element would be this: organized by the psychic being and centered around the psychic being. So let's say your faculty of mind developed. If the psychic influence was largely cut out, and you just went through whatever training, you went through your IITs, technical prowess, developed it, cut off completely from the psychic. You've got a nice trained mind, driven by what? Driven by whatever impulses and drives on the surface might exist in your nature. Quite a large part of this might be shed, or an essential content of it might be retained. Oh, this is what it is like to have a rich, clear, developed mind. That's it. But if the substance of the mental being has been organized by the psychic influence and centered around this psychic influence, then it is as if tied to and forms a part of it, is infused with the psychic substance, and is therefore withdrawn and held in the psychic consciousness to be deployed again into the next. Because our substance infused with and belonging to the psychic personality. So here's the interesting thing. To this, Sri Aurobindo says, provided they are organized by and centered around the true psychic being, they share the immortality of the psychic. This is so important. If the psychic being is immortal and the mind, life, and physical body are not immortal, the part of the mind, life, body that are so organized by the psychic and centered around the psychic, infused with the psychic, psychicized is the term we will use, those portions share the immortality of the psychic. In such a case, when there is a reincarnation, in those parts, those abilities and capacities could be drawn forward, if needed, with relevant memories. Or if the choices are different, those elements would be withdrawn and certain other aspects brought forward, but they would still be there as a potential capacity. So you might have chosen after an intellectual development and artistic turn. So the intellectual development would be held behind for the artistic flow, but it would be present as an implicit clarity and precision of the mind, which the person has never developed or does not belong to the environment in which he developed his art. And that would come from the psychic's development of this clarity of mind. In the way the memory carries also, it is memory in the essence, not in specific details. You will not remember texts that you have read specifically, but the familiarity of the text, the content, and the familiarity with that thought might be there. You may not, for example, have to replicate certain patterns of intelligence, for example, technical intelligence or precision of thought. But the tendency for precision of thought would give you great joy and would be familiar, and you would tend, therefore, to flow through those grooves, which were already developed and are familiar to you. If there has been an intuitivization in the mind, then the familiarity with that feeling would come. I will share a very personal experience here because it gives a good example, but it's also something which I was able to understand only later. I perhaps mentioned this once before. When I was at some point in the early teenage, I was interested in many things, including astrology, palmistry, but always to try to understand how it works. But I was playing with it, and my teacher, MP Pandit, encouraged it. So there was a point where I noticed what I was doing. I had read, this line means that one means that, okay. But I was always asking, why? Why should this line mean that? There must be some underlying principle, some rationale. So when somebody's hand I was asked to see, then I would observe those things. I would say the things which were familiar, already known. I had a limited set of lines. I knew what they meant. So I would go through that. And increasingly, as this was happening, the state of mind would drift to a poise which was deeper inward. And it would take a little while. And then suddenly it was as if there's like a room and a passage into a room, a certain state. And pop, now I'm there. Once I'm there now, I don't care anymore what the lines are saying. You could ask any question, and there would be the intuitive insight of what it meant. Or the intuition would guide where to look for an indication for that, but it would not even need to know what the lines mean. It would know what was there behind. At that time, I still had, this is the nuance of personality, I had a very strong bias to never say something negative. Only positives. Even if I saw something negative, I would find a way to give it a positive turn and say it, otherwise not say at all, or not even choose to see if there was only negative. And I remember there was one particular case of a person for whom he was a businessman, he was going through a lot of difficulties, and my teacher said, look at his hand and let's see what comes there. So I sat with him and I went into that space and I got nothing. Because there was nothing positive. And a long time, almost half an hour. I said everything else, but when it came to his specific question about the business, it was blank. I knew at a deeper level what it meant, but because of that very strong, hard choice to never speak or even see negative, it was like a filter blocking the expression of that on the surface. And at the end, Panditji also commented, we've never had such a long gap of no response. Some words he used to that effect. But it was unusual and it was obvious. Then finally the thing had failed and he had to sell off the business, whatever it was. But I'm giving this as an example of an ability which I had, maybe must have been at that point 12, between 10 and 12. But the familiarity with that poise was obviously from work done before. It was as if I knew how to go back and the thing to which to go back until suddenly it slipped and popped as if like through a passage into the state. That's it. Now it's familiar. But the first few times that it would have happened, I don't have a clear memory of that. When it happened, it was so familiar. It was so comfortable. It was so effortless. It felt good. It was like being home in some sense. So that familiarity was what drew things in that direction. But I cannot recall when it would have happened. It might have happened many times, or it was a gradual process. but the familiarity as if was always there and it gradually dawns. So this is how the memory of prior capacities developed can be transmitted or carried over into the next. It doesn't mean that if you had developed engineering skills that you will have the exact engineering knowledge. It means you'll have the familiarity with the engineering skills that today, if you start learning or going through a formal engineering course, it comes so naturally, so effortlessly that you have to make that it's as if you knew it all along. But you still have to remember, you still have to learn as if to draw out that memory for the details, for the specifics, because the specifics of surface formulas may not always be carried. But there could be exceptional cases where material from the mind of the previous personality are actually retained and brought forward with that kind of content. And such a person may even be able to draw upon precise formula remembered from a prior life. Doesn't mean everything might be carried, but certain things, the fragments which are there would still be, might be precise down to words, down to songs, down to formulas, down to images, and the memory associated with it, again in a general way, but with precise detail. To that part only. That's what I meant by general way. So they share the immortality of the psychic. Now, this is so important because this is really the theme of our current discussion of how to carry consciousness across lives. How do we do that? How does that happen? What are the 3 requirements to carry the consciousness in continuity is what will be the discussion over the next couple of sessions at least. So just complete this letter. The soul gathers the essential elements of its experiences in life and makes that its basis of growth in the evolution. When it returns to birth, it takes up its mental, vital, physical sheets. It takes up with its mental, vital, and physical sheets so much of its karma as is useful to it in the new life for further experience. So again, it's something we discussed earlier. It's not as if all your karma is hanging on you, and you have the freedom even to select which elements of the karma are useful for the experience to be worked out. It is really for the vital part of the being that Shraddha and rites are done. Shraddha is the special prayers that you do for those who have passed on, and other rites which are associated with people who have passed on. It is for the vital part, he says, to help the being to get rid of the vital vibrations which still attach it to the earth or to the vital worlds, so that it may pass quickly to its rest in the psychic peace. So if the vital attachments are strong, it could bind to physical earth or attach to the vital worlds and get you stuck there or delayed there. Things we've already discussed, so I don't go more into that. So there are a few other letters of this kind which elaborate. Many have elements which repeat. Comes an important part, and I'm skipping the large part of the portion of the initial part of the letter and going straight to the portion which is important. Yeah, I think I'm going to read a bit more. The movement of the vital being dropping its outer, its vital and mental sheets on its way to the psychic plane is its normal movement after death. But there can be any number of variations. One can return directly from the vital plane without passing on to farther and higher states. And there are cases of an almost immediate rebirth, sometimes even attended with detailed memory of the events of the past life. Then, in answer to multiple questions, he writes, hell and heaven are often imaginary states of the soul, or rather of the vital being, which it constructs about it after its passing. So we spoke of the constructed worlds earlier. What is meant by hell is a painful passage through some vital world or a dolorous lingering there. As for instance, in many cases of suicide, where one remains surrounded by the forces of suffering and turmoil created by this unnatural and violent exit. So this is the warning Mother always gave people, never to even think of suicide. The way it was told to us, if once you commit suicide, you are as if stuck in that groove for multiple lives until you're able to finally overcome that challenge and get free from it. So you're always warned, don't commit suicide, because then you'll be stuck with the suicidal tendency for many lives. And they were actually told 7 lives you'll be stuck. So you never know whether this is the seventh or it's the first of the seven. So you don't want to fool around with that idea. But more than that, it's the suffering and turmoil created by this unnatural and violent exit. You are surrounded by that and you are stuck with it. And that is the difficult passage. There are also, of course, real worlds of mind and vital worlds, which are penetrated with joyful or dark experiences. And one may pass through these as the result of things formed in the nature which create the necessary affinities. So all your anger, hatred will pull you into those domains which are dark and heavy. Very simple. All your joyous opening with affection and love and selfless service will open you to the higher ranges, because that's the grade of consciousness in which these things take place. But the idea of reward or retribution is a crude and vulgar conception, and we can discard it as a mere popular error. So again, he throws out those conventional ideas. Now comes the memory. There is no rule of complete forgetfulness in the return of the soul to rebirth. There are, especially in childhood, many impressions of the past life which can be strong and vivid enough. But a materializing education and the overpowering influences of the environment must often, but not quite always, prevent their true nature from being recognized. So it's a fact. Many young children tend to carry some impressions of past life. But the education which is materializing, it forces you to bind with the biology only, and the influence of the environment, which also distract you and exteriorize you. These are the things which prevent you from knowing what the real thing is. What is actually a past life memory or just some other impression or some imagination. All these are lost, or even the things, the memory is gone. There are even a number of people who have definite recollections of a past life. But these things are discouraged by education and the atmosphere and cannot remain or develop. So if right from the beginning you're told, no, 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 you stop paying attention to it. Many of the so-called psychic abilities are natural with young children. And if at that point you encourage, it's easy to build it to adulthood. If at that point it's neglected or discouraged, it weakens and dies out. Now, if this is true of psychic abilities, it's equally true of more superficial abilities, including your intelligence and power of observation and creativity and so on. So I believe, and I have confirmed this in many cases, that if you start early enough giving value to these faculties, depending on children's maturity, if you start early enough, that you can very quickly, for those who are ready, develop and flower out many of the higher faculties, even of mind. And so save yourself a long, needless struggle of the passage of development, because everything was ready and you just had to support and nourish it. That's the basis for many of the so-called prodigies, child prodigies. So paying attention is important. How you pay, positive or negative, that's important. In most cases, they're stifled out of existence. At the same time, so it's a suffocating influence which blocks and closes those doors. At the same time, it must be noted that what the psychic being mainly carries away with it and brings back is ordinarily the essence and the effect of the experiences it had in former lives and not the details. So that you cannot expect the same coherent memory as one has of past happenings in the present existence. So it's a different kind of memory. A soul can go straight to the psychic world, but that depends on the state of consciousness at the time of departure. So we come to something crucial. What's the state of consciousness at the time of departure? And if it is the right state, you can go straight to the psychic world. If the psychic is in front at the time, this immediate transition is possible. It does not depend on the acquisition of a mental and vital as well as psychic immortality. Those who have acquired that would rather have the power to move about in the different planes and even act on the physical world without being bound to it. So we don't know the exact question which was placed, but he's answering a very specific question. You do not have to have acquired the immortality of the mental, vital, or the psychic for this purpose to be able to go directly. Those who have that would simply spend the time to wander and explore the different planes and act upon the physical world from those planes, if you have so developed those layers within you. So let's say now your mind is not sufficiently individualized and integrated. Your vital is not sufficiently individualized and integrated. Your normal trajectory would be dissolution of both these sheets, retiring into the psychic, and then returning, gathering new material, and taking birth. But if you work to individualize the mind and the vital sufficiently around the psychic influence, and that individuality is sufficiently now stable and able to hold on its own, then now when you come out of the body, having shed the portions which are no more relevant, you keep this core individuality, which is tied to the psychic personality. And with that, now you're able to wander across these worlds as an active, independent being. And then from there, you're able to engage even and act upon physical circumstances because you have now the vehicles needed. Only the last part of the physical influence is missing. But from those vehicles, you can sufficiently densify even to reach out influences to a material realm, for example, if that skill is developed without being bound to the physical. On the whole, it may be said that there is no one rigid rule for these things. Manifold variations are possible depending upon the consciousness, its energies, tendencies, formations. Although there's a general framework and design into which all fit and take their place. So that's what we have been so far studying in our text from the Life Divine. But look at these things, depending on the consciousness, its energies, tendencies, and formations. Dwell on each of these as an exercise and see what it leads you to and what the difference is between them and how the four interact with each other. And you get the full spectrum of variations possible. So I think we will pause with the letters here at this point. We will next time go back to the text of the Life Divine, where he takes up something extremely important, where he explains how within us, in the soul itself, are certain essential, let's say, focal points of consciousness corresponding to the mental, vital, and physical planes, and the spiritual. It is through these and by these that we engage with and build the connection to those planes. Or we build those bodies and develop those bodies as evolving psychic beings. And this is going to come to a very deep and esoteric understanding of the whole mechanism and the way we work and the way the evolution takes place. So it's an important paragraph. After completing this, we will go straight to the last portion where the immortalize, the continuity of consciousness across lives will be taken up. And it will be as if a continuation of this portion. So I hope to close this topic in another 2 or 3 sessions. One important announcement for next time is I will be over the next few weeks traveling, and some of the schedules will be a little erratic. There are certain days when I'm sure to be able to come online for the live sessions, but there are 3 days particularly where I will not be able to come online. And for those dates, we will have a prior recording, which will be webcast. And this, unfortunately, I cannot let you know right now, especially for next Saturday. It's not very clear what it will be. But if for some reason we are unable to have the live session, there will be a different talk of a different topic with a youth group that we will put online. Otherwise, if I can make it, then we will have the continuation of this text. For now, I'll just quickly look at the chat box for anything to be taken up immediately. Vivek is saying, materializing education, how true. Kids are so overwhelmed with this schoolwork for 12 to 25 years. The soul is drowned out in our educational system. Yes, the dulling effect of such a crude, coarse, superficializing and distracting education. But if the same time was dedicated to a psychic turn in the education itself and a spiritual turn to the education and the sense of purpose of life, those very years could be used to further amplify and develop these possibilities. So it's not the fact of how many years of educational time are spent, it is the nature of the education which is so stifling and damaging. So Zen is asking, is it possible to access the life review flashback from the psychic being through meditation? And how does discrimination, discernment, viveka, play a role in exhausting or transcending vital impulses on the path? It's important. So first of all, the flashback is done by the psychic being, not by you approaching the psychic being, because the perspective is of the psychic, and it is only done when it is ready to leave. But there is an equivalent which may take place in a state of deep immersion, let's say, in the psychic influence. But it's not quite the same thing. So be very clear, until you are identified with the psychic being fully, this question itself of the flashback does not arise. So, and you're not. At best, you come close initially and stay in closeness to its influence. But in that state, when you look back at your life, not as an instantaneous flashback because you're not in that consciousness, but you can look back and feel and see and value those special moments which were nourishing to you, to the psychic aspiration, to the spiritual aspiration. Those moments which were decisive influences that turned you or woke you or awakened something deeper or led you to something deeper, which were breakthroughs, whatever else. Those things you can turn and dwell upon. And sometimes it's interesting that they may not have an obvious spiritual connotation, but they would still have a great value from the psychic point of view. And yes, those kinds of things one can surely dwell upon. And when you look back, you see there's so little actually of a typical life that you would really want to look back and carry and hold. And sometimes even if you observe the nature of that, it might be more a mood or a state than specifics of an event. In my case, for example, the most valuable, the most precious memories that I have, which are the most nourishing of this life, are of the last few years that I had in close contact with my teacher, immersed in the psychic presence, where I would come back from school and sit and just bathe in that atmosphere. What did I do? I don't know. I don't remember too much detail. I don't remember too much of conversations. Maybe there were none, but just that immersion. And those are the most beautiful. And immediately after the school, certain experiences that he was able to convey and transmit. That's, if I look back, those are like the peak experiences. And then there are certain experiences which come much later, which represent certain steps in the opening of the consciousness and so on, but they are relatively few compared to this sustained period. So looking back, one can say, yes, those were the most valuable, the most precious, the most nourishing. But then it's not enough to look back. That which you hold now, can you live in it more and more? Can that become the base for you now to grow into something still deeper and higher? That should be the effort. Flashback is only useful as a reference for the future work to be done, as an inspiration or as a base, as a platform from which to move to the future. The second question of Zen has to do with discernment, viveka, playing a role in exhausting or transcending vital impulses on the path. Yes, obviously there has to be some discernment. You can't say that, hey, every impulse that comes, I'm going to take it to its full. That would be extremely harmful and would actually lead to some kind of a distraction even from your real purpose. But some discrimination and deeper insight would be required to be able to make the most of those occasions. I think that's it for today. Let's then look back at what we covered today, and the most important key elements we touched upon, that choice that we make at the time when we leave and the state of consciousness in which we are. This was significant. And the importance of integrating mind, emotions, life energies, even the body consciousness around the psychicization of these, which will then be the individuality that we will carry into the next without needing to lose that. The value of the work done in the past, which still reflects, which still influences, sometimes profoundly, even though we may not have specifics of the memory. But it's not important. It's not so much about the past influencing today. I'm going to turn it around and say, what you're doing today now will be the valuable influences for your future lives. So focus on this and the moments and the periods and the states in which you can be in deep immersion in the divine presence, in the psychic presence, in the overall turn of your aspiration and the purpose for which you're born, that these could be the references and the foundations for your future efforts in future lives even. That should be our effort. Drawing on the past, yes, but building the present for the future. And for this, when occasionally you have things which might come as potential frustrations or diversions or partial realizations of your soul's aspiration, call for the help. Call for the Divine Mother to guide you, to lead you, to free you from certain entanglements where necessary, so that you may pass through those difficulties and overpass with that help. And let's make the most of this opportunity. This lifetime is one of the most significant for which all the past lives may have prepared you for, and which will be the basis for the most important changes in the shift of consciousness and priority in human evolution. So give it its due, give it its importance, and make the most of each opportunity, each day, each moment even. Let's hold ourselves in aspiration in this. Namaste.
Namaste.